Yeah, I'm okay. I'm ready to go.
Okay, let's do it. I'm excited. Okay. Make sure I break nothing here. You know, I love my husband. He just started recording remotely from the school parking lot where he's picking up our child. Okay, there we go. We're on, we're going. That's the beauty of technology right there. So we have an awesome leadership panel, and I am so grateful to each of you for joining us and bringing such different perspectives to kind of where we see the future path of rare disease going with respect to collaboration and developments and research and all of that. So this is really just kind of our chance to pick your brains and talk about where you are right now and where you see us going in the future. So I'm not even going to introduce you guys. I'm going to let you introduce yourselves because I'm kind of in awe of each of you and fangirling. But I will have Kareem kick it off and share.
Thank you, Eden. Honored to be on this leadership panel. A big hello from Dubai, where I'm currently based. It's past midnight right now. So wishing everyone good morning. I've been in pharmaceuticals for the last 23 years. I've started my career in Big Pharma, but I left Big Pharma in 2011. And at that time, I was really looking for the big purpose or the calling, and I wanted to do something I'm passionate about, something where you can actually see your impact on people's life. And the natural choice being in pharma was to move to rare disease. At that time, in 2012, I set up our company, GenPharm, with a partner, and we are focused on rare and genetic disease treatments, providing access to these therapies in the Middle East region. So collaborating and working with companies out of the US or Europe that have approved drugs. And we make sure to bring them over to the region and helping the rare disease community get access to these treatments. So it's been a fantastic 9 years. And we're looking forward to the future when we see the exciting science that's taking place and the gene therapy era that we are entering and the fantastic solutions that we are able now to provide to these patients.
Incredible. Thank you. I could listen to you actually go on about the 9 years all day, but I'll be good. And Leslie, do you want to pick up?
Sure. So I'm Leslie Meltzer, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Medical Affairs and Clinical Operations at Orchard Therapeutics, which is a company that's developing ex vivo HSC gene therapies for the treatment of rare genetic diseases, primarily those diseases where there are little to no treatment options today. I've been working in the biopharma world for about 11 years. Actually, before that, trained as a neuroscientist at Stanford. I worked in a very competitive, busy lab with scientists who've gone on to develop CRISPR and other technologies. And it was a very exciting time for me. And I became very interested in thinking about the translation of the work being done in the lab and ways to bring that to patients more quickly and to make sure that there was a nice way to translate the learnings of the lab to the general public and to the broader community, which is the type of work we do in medical affairs, which is really about translating new discoveries to the external healthcare community and the patient community. So I've been working primarily in rare disease during that time. I joined Orchard about 2.5 years ago because I was really excited about the opportunities presented by this gene therapy approach, this HSC gene therapy approach, which we're currently studying in a variety of indications in rare diseases and potentially beyond as well. And thank you for having me today. Really excited to be here.
I love how you just casually threw out the whole Stanford bit, like, you know, and I did my grocery shopping last Tuesday. Okay. Adam, you're up.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. So I'm Adam Resnick. I direct the Center for Data-Driven Discovery in Biomedicine here at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Like Leslie, I was actually trained in neurosciences. So I did my training in neuroscience, not at Stanford, at Hopkins, and then came to CHOP. But maybe with similar underpinnings, you know, the neurosciences end up being an area of convergence across domains of research. The central nervous system essentially integrates across many different modalities. It's often implicated in many rare diseases, especially in a pediatric and developmental setting. And so when I came to CHOP, I was really trying to harness that neuroscience expertise and really leverage it on behalf of pediatric developmental context, and more specifically was interested in the intersection between pediatric cancers, which are rare, and development, and then other congenital birth defects ultimately. And in many ways, one of the things that's always been a challenge in this concept of the rare, and especially with a focus in pediatrics, it's great that diseases are rare. We want our kids to be healthy. But for example, pediatric brain tumors or pediatric cancers are the leading cause of disease-related death in children. So that those two sentences don't go together, this concept of a rare disease and a leading cause of diseases-related death. And it was clear that the technology has advanced in the ways that both Karim and Leslie had mentioned, to the point where there are opportunities to leverage new technologies specifically on behalf of extracting the full opportunity landscape in the context of the rare, but that you actually have to think about doing science and applying it in a new way. And it's bringing those two things together that's really underpinned many of our efforts here as an academic institution at CHOP.
Wow, I'm going to take my state school degree and go. Just so glad that all of you are here, because the perspectives are so incredibly different, but all overlapping in so many areas. And a lot of what we've been talking about this week is kind of collaboration and what does the ideal model look like for collaboration. So I know here we think about, okay, patient, caregiver, obviously you've got policy issues that you would fold into there, your payers, your physicians, your researchers, your clinicians, industry stakeholders. What do your models look like, or what do you think the ideal collaborative model would look like if we could just build whatever we wanted? And anybody just feel free to jump in. We're going to play it fast and loose on this Friday.
Yeah, maybe I can just start by answering this question, because we live in a corner of the globe. It's a very heterogeneous region. In fact, we in the Middle East and North Africa, if you club all the countries together, the population is almost 300 million people. And that's the exact number of rare disease patients living around the world. So if you look at this, imagine if all the region was populated with rare disease patients. It's a staggering figure. When we talk about rare disease in the region here, because many of the things are in the early stage and in their infancy, such as, for example, patient advocacy is just starting to take shape. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I don't see that there is a specific model. But one thing where I believe collaboration is really key is when it comes to patient registries, as an example. And now we still are in a place where people are mostly working in silos. And then the other aspect is, and this is one of the things that GenPharm does, we bring together experts from across the region to make sure that there's a consensus on diagnosing and treatment guidelines for specific diseases, so that people are sharing best practice. And we obviously look at what's happening in the US, since this is where most of the science is starting, or Europe, and we try to adapt to some of the local realities that we have here. Very diverse ethnicities around the region, very strong anchored traditions coming from our different cultural aspects. As an example, consanguinity is very high. Almost half of the marriages still remain interfamily marriages. Which leads to some of the inherited genetic diseases being more prevalent than in other regions of the world. So I think just bringing these centers of excellence together, creating that communication platform where they can exchange information about what they see in their clinic, how they go about diagnosing, how they go about treating, and putting this together into a patient registry, so that companies that are in the US or in Europe interested to conduct clinical trials can actually have access to these registries. And this is something that we've just started to build. I know it's a very steep climb, but that's what we like the challenge, and this is what we're going to do. So definitely collaboration is a key. I haven't been able to crack what the model would look like, but we're trying to create that platform of exchange of information in different aspects.
Fantastic.
I can chime in just to support Karim's view of I think we're climbing the same mountain, as it were, and if you listen to what Karim mentioned, the challenge is informational, And so collaboration, and actually maybe by definition, when you say platform brings communities and knowledge together in a way that's interpretable and queryable. And so, for example, I've visited the Middle East multiple times, in part because connectivity of data resources, for example, between Middle East patients and US-based patients, even for the reason that Kareem mentioned, that the underpinning for rare disease in the Middle East might be because of consanguinity or other sources. But leveraging those data resources can help both ends of the equation solve problems, understand the disease landscape. Something that might be common in one area might be much more rare in another area, even under the umbrella of the rare. But the most important part for us, the model has been near real-time data sharing. Because in principle, what's changed in the 21st century has been that we're no longer under the impression that if there's something we can't fix. The reason we can't fix something is if we don't understand it or don't know how it works. And the way to support that knowledge building is to connect information as rapidly as possible. And so whenever you have any one rare patient, the minute you can connect any piece of information from that rare patient to another rare event somewhere else, suddenly the informational knowledge gain is exponential. It's not just doubling. You actually know a lot more by just connecting two. I mean, you connect three. So connectivity of data itself is a sort of a defined principle. It's almost like an axiom that increases the value of information. The second axiom is that the more different types of people look at that data, the more information they can actually extract from that connected data resource. So that's the second axiom, that you have to connect data as rapidly as possible, and you have to let as many and as diverse a community touch and look and explore that data, because they'll bring in their own informational knowledge into that area. So those are two core principles that have underpinned at least most of our models. And in academic enterprises, most people think, academics, in contrast to commercial entities, share freely, connect freely. But Leslie mentioned, a high-powered lab. Most high-powered labs are themselves, fighting for grants, for publications, for primacy of discovery. So changing the model of primacy of time as a variable that you're trying to optimize in the informational space requires new models of information sharing and commitment to aligning those practices in ways that allow us to climb that mountain that Kareem described.
Yeah, that point around what different parties are able to bring and making sure that you can facilitate that sharing of information, I think is incredibly important. And ultimately, for any collaboration to be successful, ideally to me, no matter who we're talking about here, the company, the academics, the patient community, whomever, sorry. It's all about identifying not just the common goal of the group, but what it is that each of those stakeholders, each of those parties brings uniquely and can contribute, and then making sure that you have all the parties at the table that can contribute the things you need in that particular activity to be successful. An area, I think, for example, the importance of collaboration within our company and outside the company with the academic world, with patients, with policymakers, is in the world of newborn screening and diagnostics, which is a crucial area for us in the gene therapy world, as we're developing therapies that have the potential to be most impactful if children are identified at birth as candidates for therapy. So we have a tremendous amount of engagement with healthcare providers, the advocacy community, to educate on that importance of timely diagnosis, and also to collaborate on the development of the diagnostic tools that we need in order to make newborn screening a reality, and partnering again with the community who have access to policymakers to make sure people have the information and are very understanding of the process to move from experimental models for newborn screening to actually implementing this in pilot studies, and ultimately implementing this at a national or state level to make sure that diagnoses happen quickly and potential therapies become available to all patients who might benefit from them.
Yeah, Leslie, and I'd like to echo your point. I mean, in the Middle East, one of the key challenges, I guess, like everywhere else in the world, is still diagnosis of rare disease. But we do suffer from, let's say, the time to diagnosis. And I use the example of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is it's been an area where we are working for the last few years. In Europe, as an example, the diagnosis happens when the kid is around 3.5 to 4 years, on average, of course. In the Middle East, we still have double that time. It's 7 to 8 years. Now, in a disease where you have treatments or effective treatments to control the progression of the disease, we're missing a huge window of opportunity, to treat these boys, make sure that the disease is controlled and they're not reaching a stage of losing ambulation or respiratory and cardiac complications. And in the absence of a widely available genetic testing, information is even more critical to have. And we need to make sure that the disease awareness, we need to make sure not only that the community of parents are aware of what the early signs and symptoms are, but also the physicians, because we find that many of these patients spend about 2 to 3 years in the primary care sector before they in fact come in front of an expert. And we're trying to do a lot of work to make sure that this time is reduced. And then as soon as these early signs and symptoms are picked up. So information is the key to this. And that's why we like to if I may say, if something was positive about being locked down in COVID, we were able to organize webinars and reach out GPs and pediatricians in the thousands that we would not have been able to reach if we were attending physical congresses, in fact. And that has really helped us spread the disease awareness that we wanted in terms of how to diagnose based on certain symptoms and make sure that these patients are referred very quickly to an expert to make sure that they can benefit early on, from the treatment for a better prognosis. So I think we face the same problems with the exchange of information, the connectivity that Adam mentioned. And of course, newborn screening would be ideal, but we also have to be realistic from a cost standpoint and even from a logistics standpoint. Having newborn screening expanded to cover all rare diseases is almost, utopic. It's like living in utopia. We wish it was true, but we have to be very selective. And that's some of the work we're trying to do to say, let's at least consider including in newborn screening the treatable diseases, because it's very difficult right now to diagnose in newborn screening diseases if there are no proper solutions. It adds to the burden, if you want. But now that we have more and more diseases being treatable, I think these should be the priority to be including in newborn screening program. And this is the discussion we're having with some of your colleagues about how to do that in the region now for MLD, now that there is an approved treatment.
Yeah, and I couldn't champion that idea more, from both Leslie and Kareem. And, this, it also intersects with, I think, where you began the conference, which is, how do you strengthen partnership and collaboration? And, so one model, for example, emerges where in the context of newborn screening or diagnostics, especially at the diagnostic layer, that diagnostic layer, if empowered, is a way to actually run clinical trials, identify new patients rapidly, right? Because in the rare disease context, that's another challenge when you're trying to actually test and iterate on therapeutic approaches. Just finding the patients is a challenge. So this opportunity to intersect a diagnostic layer with the informational flow provides a key opportunity for commercial entrants to partner with academics, with the foundations or patient populations that want to advance this. So diagnostics is a key layer of opportunity that harnesses the informational context. We're used to, in the 21st century, having information at our fingertips, thinking of information as media. You can query anything, you can look at anything, it flows in real time. Healthcare has not yet adopted a model of healthcare as media. And if it did, it would start thinking about the advantages that you could drive forward in this setting. And I think that's the part that's really opportunistic, in the rare disease context, because that healthcare disparity context that Kareem mentioned between Northern Africa to the US, even within the United States, for example, there's tremendous disparity of access to diagnostics. There's little uniformity across that space in many regions that undergo that same prolonged sort of darkness of misinformation or lack of information, and diseases that, time is the variable that you need to optimize for.
Such a good point. And what you were saying with regards to, this collaboration model, and we've got so many disparities just here in the US that we see frequently, and it comes up time and again where somebody goes, we had a panel on diversity at Rare Fair. And this is when you said that, this hit me in particular. And we had a lady come in, she's African-American, and she said, okay, I know my son is sick. I know what he needs. He's got sickle cell. I've gone in to my PCP after seeing all the specialists, and I've said, what do I do? How do I manage this? Can you come on board with me? And she was scheduled with her PCP that day, but however, saw somebody else in the practice. And the implication or the inference that was given to her was, why was she so concerned with her cultural background? Because typically those parents weren't that involved in their child's care. And my heart broke for this woman, and she's got tears. And at the end of the session, everybody's crying in this breakout because you just want your kid to feel better. You don't want somebody questioning your motives. You just want help. You want to get them to where, and Kareem, you can speak to it. You want people to have access and not feel less than because they've got some kind of genetic deletion or abnormality. Who cares? So how do we, as leaders, kind of say, okay, we're done here. We're not letting this happen anymore. We're going to make sure that nobody is left behind. How do we leverage the systems and the tools in place? How do we get a more universal RESP? How do we implement this? I mean, short of all of us just flying to DC and knocking on doors and saying, okay, we're starting here in our own backyard. You're going to sit and listen. How can we leverage the tools and systems that are in place already to kind of break down these barriers and create something that is more comprehensive? So no physician is ever uneducated enough to make a comment like that ever again. And kudos to that mom for not punching out that doctor, because I don't know that I could have done the same in her position.
Eden, this is such a difficult or sensitive point to discuss, because culture is beautiful. Every culture is beautiful, but sometimes these traditions or that are anchored are kind of slowing down the progress and slowing down the things where we want to get at. And I can give you an example, which is a typical example. The rare diseases are still in many societies a taboo subject, especially in societies where the structure of the society is tribal. The family is always worried about sharing the fact that there is a rare disease kid in the family. What's the future of that kid? How could that future, be developed? What is the impact on the larger family? Will the siblings be able to find a husband or a wife? What would the neighbors be saying? And all these things are real issues that people, have to deal with. And I can recall, for example, speaking to a geneticist that is one of the major, KOL experts in genetics here. They have, a very strong influence in terms of knowledge, but their opinion is not binding, meaning that when the couple that's planning their marriage come to visit them and they have a discussion and they tell them that based on your genetics, there is a certain chance for you to have an offspring with that or that disease, that opinion is taken into account. But at the end of the session, the geneticist is telling me many times we get handed over the invitation to the wedding and we're told, thank you for your advice. And the couple is out of the door simply because, they've been promised to each other and the marriage has to go on, and whatever happens, happens, or, there's someone up there making these decisions for us. So it's very difficult sometimes to navigate, in particular for these young couples, to navigate these, traditions and some of the, like the resistance, especially from the older generation that you might see. And this is across the region a serious issue when we speak to parents, is the cultural and the taboo aspects of having a kid with a rare disease. And it's going to take time. It's going to take education. And, you know, when you spoke about the African-American mother with a sickle cell kid, I immediately made that analogy that, you know, this is in the US. It's also happening here. I'm sure it happens in Latin America. I'm sure it happens in some corners in Europe. So in fact, you know, the world is not so different, where we have many similarities, if not more similarities than differences.
And I think that's a great point about the diversity of experience. No, every family's experience is their unique experience. And in order for those who are not part of a particular community to get an understanding of the lives of a community, the more people who share their unique experience, the more opportunity is to bring that information together and actually drive toward change or improving the way people are experiencing the world. And you thinking back to the question around collaboration, the efforts to bring those unique voices and individual stories together in a way that highlights both the similarities and commonalities through these experiences, but also those unique aspects, so we aren't neglecting elements of individual families' experiences, I think is really crucial. And it's the kind of thing that can really catalyze advocacy and change what is being done for a particular disease when potential stakeholders are seeing the different facets of it that might not be the most obvious or the most publicized. And anytime I see someone speaking publicly, anytime I see someone in a forum like this, I'm learning one new thing about that experience that I didn't know before that's going to inform the work that I do every day. So I just always am encouraging people to speak out when they can, because there's people like me who are listening and really care and want to do something about it.
Yeah, and maybe I can just add one layer to what both, you know, Leslie and Kareem mentioned, which we found sort of really empowering, which is often disparities occur on the local level, right? You know, Kareem mentioned sort of culture, but it turns out that, you know, we brought, for example, mothers from the US together with mothers from China, together from mothers from any other country. Any mother of a rare disease child immediately connects to any other mother of a rare disease child. And so in many ways, you know, it's almost the transnational context across cultures and diversity provides an alternate form of connection that may be missing in context of prejudice or disparities locally. And I think those can be at odds and potentially subvert one another in ways that could be really powerful, if that makes sense.
Total. I mean, for us, it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. Somebody else is living that rare disease experience. We're kind of all under one umbrella. And I have yet to see a situation where a parent doesn't take up for another parent just because their child has a different diagnosis, or even as an adult. You know, most of my adult friends, we don't share any of the same diagnoses. I'm the only person I know who has my rare disease diagnosis, but it's a shared experience, as you said, of we've all had kind of those background markers we bring to the table as far as our personal experience, whether that's cultural or socioeconomic, whatever that may be. It's part of the bigger holistic picture for us. But something we say around here a lot that we love is I've got a friend named Kevin Mott who lives with a kidney disease. And Kevin's in Chicago. And one of the things that he taught me that I tell people all the time is he says, it's time to acknowledge, not anchor. And that blows me away that, yes, we see that there are these issues, but if we're going to solve anything, we can't anchor our hopes and dreams for the future and getting people the resources they need, diagnosis and treatment, and everything else, if we're going to anchor in all the negativity that is so easy to be mired in right now. So how do we, is kind of from a leadership perspective, what are each of you doing where you're at in your organizations to try to elevate and get people on the path to, let's acknowledge these experiences, let's give them the credit that they're due, and keep in mind that there are factors and barriers, like Kareem, like you said, you know, the cultural, you don't want to make mom and dad mad. You know, this is ingrained. How do you elevate people up out of their situation and kind of formulate this forward thinking, we're all in this together, let's go and prove the rest, or what have you. Let's go find the treatment together. Let's collaborate. Let's share the data. How do we do that?
Yeah, Leslie, one aspect I'd like to mention as well, and answering to your question, if I look back at when we started almost 10 years ago, 9 years ago now, to where we are today, the progress has been tremendous in terms of regulations, in terms of legislations. In that time span, the ministries of health here have introduced fast track reviews, which were not the case before. We don't have something called orphan drug designation like in the US, but because we follow the lead in terms of regulatory approvals in the US and Europe, if a drug is classified as orphan drug designation, it goes through fast track review, and the registrations have really been happening quite fast in terms of approvals. So this has really improved the pace or the speed of access to these therapies here immediately following, a few months after an FDA or an EMA approval. So that's a tremendous, one of the success stories, if you want. The one thing where I feel on the other side of the spectrum, where we still have to do a lot of work, is how do we make or support the patient groups from getting out of the social gathering mentality or sharing experiences mentality only to becoming a real voice in the community in terms of supporting, legislation, sharing experiences with the wider community instead of just between themselves. How do we get them to sit in front of legislators? How do we get them to, support research? And we're a bit jealous when we look at the role that patient associations can play today in Europe and in the US in terms of influencing or even funding clinical trials. I think this is one area where we need a lot of progress and focus to be done, making sure that the tools are in place for the patient societies to be more than social gatherings and really have an influence on the landscape overall.
Yeah, I can follow that. I think I 100% agree, and it's not unique to the Middle East. It's interesting. Patients oftentimes don't recognize, even if we talk about information, for example, the power that they have even over their own information and data from a hospital system. There's this model that still exists a bit in the context of healthcare of paternalism, where essentially the data are in the clinical domain at the hospital interface or with the researcher. But what's changed over the last several years, and even through legislation here in the US, is the empowered context of an individual over their own healthcare data and information in ways that they can truly make it portable. They could share it, they could assign it to somebody to look at or review in ways that was not available before. It doesn't mean that you can just go to your hospital right now and suddenly get all your data, but now the mandate is there. And so we need to support tools and resources that can really bring that patient population into ownership and governance over their data in ways that can empower it for discovery. Then that happens through the development of platforms, as Karim mentioned before, because you have to do two things at the same time. One, you want to harness distinct communities that share a rare disease context because they're empowering each other. But you can't require each one of them to reinvent the wheel in terms of the mechanisms of empowerment. So oftentimes there's a challenge of, do we create a portal for this disease and this disease and this disease? Or do we create a central repository for this disease and this disease and this disease? You need to do that, but you miss the opportunity of additional discovery by not thinking and planning for connectivity across those domains. Over and over, we find that the rare actually connects, that biology is conservative in some respects, and that genes that are implicated in one context are re-implicated in another context, oftentimes completely different and bewildering ways, but in ways that if we had connected the two things in advance, we would have short-circuited some time for discovery. I remember, I'll give you just a brief example. I literally was working in a lab above another lab. They were studying a rare genetic condition that causes sort of bone deposition, and we were studying rare brain tumors. They had discovered a causative gene for their disease in 2006. The exact same gene, the exact same mutation was implicated in a cancer we were studying, but we didn't discover it until our community until 2014. If we had just connected across the data sets and across the informational gap, there would have been many more opportunities in advance of that. And so patients' foundations need to drive that connectivity, because researchers, commercial entities are going to have to focus on the things that they know best. Connections can be empowered through patients and their communities themselves in some ways, through platforms and tools, and through their self-governance of information and mandate.
And I think piggybacking off of that a little bit, the patient voice is so important in facilitating the ability of that information to be gathered in the first place by lowering barriers to entry to participate. So I'm thinking, for example, in natural history studies, where there's a desire to capture not just the standard clinical assessments, but also the impact on quality of life of individual patients, or quality of life of their parents or other caregivers. And a group of researchers might be designing a very clever study that has hundreds of questionnaires that take hours to complete and don't fit in with the lifestyle of an individual who may be spending, up to 17 hours a day caregiving for a child who is sick with a rare disease. So I think, elevating the patient voice in the design of these collaborative projects, when selecting endpoints, when mapping out exactly when things will be collected over time. Just as an example, I've been working for the past year on NORD's home study, which is an MLD registry, which is actually a collaborative project between the patient community and the FDA. And it was designed with a tremendous amount of patient advocacy input to help really pick out the tools that were going to be used to capture the patient experience, the frequency with which that would be done, finessing the video capture instruments that would be used to make sure that time was being spent on topics that were most relevant to the families and maybe of interest to, there may have been things that were of potential interest, but ultimately were going to be very difficult to capture in this context in a way that wasn't going to dramatically interfere with the lives of the families that were participating. Because ultimately, if it's going to be that challenging to participate, people just won't participate. And you miss out on that important voice that I think is going to allow companies like our company to develop treatments that are particularly meaningful in those populations that haven't been or haven't been well characterized to date. It's the best way to ensure you get that information is to facilitate the ability of people to provide it.
Yeah, Leslie, and I'd like to echo this as well, because you mentioned natural history studies as an example. One of the things also that we're really encouraging for it to happen is to look a bit more at epidemiology. There was I mentioned earlier about some mutations being prevalent in one area, and then maybe it's not the same mutation in another country. So epidemiology is very important, and that's really a project that can be done, regardless of boundaries. This could be a regional project. It could be an international project. So this is something that's really critical for us, and we see it as we talk to different companies who are developing treatments for rare disease. They want to come and do clinical trials in our region, but sometimes we don't have enough epidemiology data to offer them so that they can come. And what ends up happening, and Adam maybe can testify to this, is we have a lot of patients from the Middle East, in fact, traveling to participate in clinical trials in Europe and in the US, which logistically is very difficult, because usually these are pediatric rare diseases. So you need an accompanying parent to travel. You've got the visa issues, you've got the cost issues that add up, and they have to stay sometimes close to the center for a long period of time, or even for the duration of the clinical trial. So having epidemiology data, knowing where the patients are, knowing which mutations are prevalent, would really help us a lot in identifying patients that could be included in clinical trials locally. And I always say that if we were to do clinical trials locally more than what is currently done, not only are we developing a local expertise in terms of treating this disease, But when there is a clinical trial, it helps us identify the patient's population as well. So more patients or more cases become diagnosed versus, the high number of patients that are misdiagnosed, non-diagnosed, or diagnosed very late. So having that combination between epidemiological research, clinical trials, and the patient voice, as we mentioned, that's an ideal platform to have.
Yeah, and this concept of real world data, that often intersects with epidemiological data is really newly empowered now through tools and resources that can support, the intersection between patient-reported data and hospital-based data sets, but provide that canvas against which a rare disease clinical trial can really be empowered. And at times, and these are things that I think the FDA is exploring as well, in the context of even rare cancers, where traditional models of a cancer, let's say clinical trial, where you have to have one arm of patients, lots of patients compared against another arm of patients for two different disease therapies, that's almost impossible in the rare disease context. So having natural history or epidemiological or virtual cohorts of data that support an interventional context and a comparator can really short circuit the time that it takes to advance. So new clinical trial models can be empowered through the combination of these resources, really dependent on the connectivity of information, its curation across time, and the bringing together of these divergent resources that Corinne just mentioned.
It's funny you also kept saying clinical trials, because that's actually our next session at HoR is decentralizing the clinical trial. So, kind of speaking to that from where each of you sit geographically and industry-wise, academia, what does that process look like if we are able to move to decentralized models? And really, is that for each of you, is that the way of the future? Do you think that's where we're headed? And there's no wrong answer, obviously. It's just, what's based on your personal opinion and your experience.
I think for us, this is really one area of development. We see a lot of interest coming from companies developing clinical trials. They want to come and do and set up centers here, but sometimes the CROs that they hire, which are usually US based, don't have really the knowledge, to know either the legislation, the process, or even which center to approach. So we got a lot of these requests coming our way, which wasn't the case a few years back. So we see that there is, a renewed interest in conducting clinical trials, and that's really something we would like to develop. I think we need some courageous people in R&D to take a chance on us in the region here, so that we can show, the good level of science, the good level of expertise. And in my argument or in my pitch, I always say this: because we have a higher prevalence and incidence of rare diseases than in many other regions of the world, our experts here, on average, see more rare disease cases than anywhere else in the world. So we know that they have the expertise, they have the experience, they've seen the clinical cases, and we just need to, tie the research into that. There's a lot of data that needs to be harnessed here. We haven't been, able to put it in a codified formal platform, if you want, but I think conducting clinical trials will be a long way towards achieving that.
I think decentralization is probably inevitable, certainly in fields like where I work in the gene therapy space, where patients, the expectation is a single treatment would have a durable, long-lasting impact on the disease. So these patients are generally followed for many years, 15 years. And some of the early studies took place at a single center in one country and are attracting patients from all over the world who are traveling year after year after year to be followed at that site that first administered the therapy. And talking before about barriers to entry, that's a model that may make it difficult for families to always participate. If you have an older child that it's difficult to travel with that child, you may have a challenge going back to the site over and over again. And we want to make sure we're collecting data consistently so we can confirm the efficacy and safety of the products that we're developing. So I think developing ways for patients, even if they're treated at one center, to ultimately be able to be monitored and followed at a location close to their home, no matter where they are in the world, I think is really essential as more and more of these studies are launching across more and more diseases, just to ensure that all of these programs can enroll patients no matter where they are.
Yeah, and again, I think it's such an opportunity in the context of technology, and it goes hand in hand with what we spoke about earlier, which is, if you can decentralize diagnostics, then you can decentralize clinical trials. They go hand in hand. And also something that came out of COVID, Kareem mentioned earlier, that one of the benefits of COVID, if there is one, is really transforming the communication and connectivity landscape of human beings. And healthcare, I think, is going to be permanently changed because of COVID in the way that it carries out telemedicine and engagement with patients that will have long-term benefits for the rare disease community. In so many ways, COVID proved both the mandate for rapid information flow, its accessibility, its connectivity, its transnationality, in ways that we can harness and empower moving forward. So that combination of decentralized diagnostic, clinical trials, and connectivity beyond physicality, I think is a really open field for the advance and acceleration of rare disease clinical trials.
I got one more that I did not send on our pre-panel question list for you guys, but would be very interested to hear what your thoughts are. So in true transparency here, our kid's pediatrician in Kansas City was my childhood pediatrician. And he was phenomenal. He was an amazing diagnostician. He was on top of things. He was very, very well read, but he was not hesitant to say, Eden, I don't know. I don't know where to go next. We'll figure it out together. What role do our PCPs, whether that be, a pediatrician or an adult physician GP, where do they fit into all of this? Is that very first touch point with, I've lost muscle strength. What's going on? Do I need some testing? Are we leaving them out of the discussion since they are that kind of layer that's a primary touch point? What do we need to be doing in the ways of educating and empowering that first layer physician before they even get to the specialist to say, okay, here, and Kareem, it goes back to those diagnostic tools again. How do we kind of loop those first touch physicians into the system and make them a resource for patients to say, you know what, you came back, it's an MLD diagnosis, but this is what I know because I've been empowered, I've done my research. Here's an option for you. Here's a study. Here's a natural history study that's going on. How do we kind of bridge that gap? Or do we just leave it up to the specialists and say, you're on your own, which I don't really want to do because obviously you're going to get into your PCP before you're going to get into a specialist. So what does that look like as far as looping them in?
So what we've been doing, as I was sharing earlier, Eden, especially this past year, we've done a lot of awareness among the community of pediatricians and GPs. And we know the parents, just like any other parent, they come very well informed. They've done the research. They've looked at, they've Googled everything, and we know that not many things are true when it comes to healthcare on Google. So they get in front of the physicians, and we are in a culture where, as we say, doctor is king. Whatever the doctor says is what stands. So there's very little, I think, at the level of the GP or pediatrician, very little exchange, in two-directional exchange. It's more a one-way exchange. And that's why sometimes these parents are left hanging a little bit too long in the primary healthcare sector before getting to the specialist. So I think the key is awareness, disease awareness. The key is having these wide meetings where we share early signs and symptoms. If you pick up on certain things, then you need to do maybe a CK test, or you need to refer, and it takes time. And obviously the GPs and the pediatricians are probably the largest segments in terms of numbers. So to reach out to everybody is going to take time. We know also that when we have gone to see some of the pediatricians and GPs, not all of them are interested in rare disease patients. Some would say, I don't want to touch these cases. I refer them immediately. Others would hang on to them, not because they're badly intent, but just simply don't have the information. So the more information sharing happens, the more improvement we will see. But this process takes a long time.
I agree. And I think awareness as empowerment here is particularly important. It's something we think about a lot, working in diseases where oftentimes the symptoms early on are non-specific, and maybe the child has a delayed milestone or two, and the typical response would be to monitor, the kind of the watch and wait and see what happens. And you might get to the point where you may rule out the ability of a child to participate in a clinical trial because the diagnostic process has taken too long. So a lot of the education, my department is very focused on supporting education, and we focus a lot and think about what is it that we need to tell primary care physicians about the world, about the advent of new therapies that are only possible from the newest technological developments, and their crucial role in the process as the first line that's seeing these children that might potentially be candidates for therapy, and what can potentially be done to, at a minimum, rule out certain diagnoses, because they're in the position to really make a difference for when a child might be eligible to enter some of these studies or not by virtue of their position. So we've done a lot to think about awareness of just the existence of new gene therapies and what that means, and what the existence of these trials means for them as the first physician often seeing these patients and hearing these complaints, mostly because just the knowing of the role that they have to play in accelerating that diagnosis, and that at the current time, an acceleration of diagnosis is particularly important in order to make sure kids can get into these trials, I think has been something we've focused on pretty heavily as we think about education.
And maybe I can add just a little bit to that. On our side, one of the things that we've done is really establish networks of hospitals that collaborate around this real-time flow of information for both research and clinical implementation. And what's clear is that one of the challenges that a primary care physician or even a non-primary care physician, in a major hospital setting is faced with is that this informational system that they interact with are largely there for billing purposes. So when a clinician actually, most of the screen time and informational space that they are navigating, they're inputting information into systems almost entirely for the purposes of billing, not for the purposes of advancing informational knowledge or its meaningfulness. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is really look at how we can build informational systems that a primary care physician could interact with easily as linked to diagnostics in ways that centralizes access to information in ways that can essentially alert or inform, where the system does some of the work for you, and you're not reliant on accessing information through journals or journal articles. These are sort of antiquated ways of conveying information in the 21st century, right? Nobody actually reads things physical anymore, but we still pretend that a PDF somehow is a reinterpretation of something physical that we have to engage in. All medicine is still communicated through PDFs, essentially a reincarnation of a physical journal. That's a really slow and laborious process of integrating information. You need that because you need a storytelling component to create knowledge. But as it relates to diagnostics and connecting someone to already existing knowledge, there are many better ways to do that and systems. And I think that's one of the places where we're trying to really develop new portals, new environments that leverage connected networks of patients and hospital systems to augment that informational interface that clinicians might have.
I feel like we could go on for days. I'm looking at the clock going, it's 3:57. Well, 3:57 here in Cream, you've got to go to bed at some point. So in a couple of words, we'll start with you. what do you think it's going to take to get leadership collaborating internationally to make kind of all of our hopes and dreams come true for rare diseases, as far as, you know, improved clinical trial access, knowledge, awareness? What do you think it's going to take to kind of break down those barriers?
Well, for us, I would say maybe in one word is just awareness. It is important for people to know that there are 2.8 million rare disease patients living in the region of the Middle East, that we have a lot of diversity, even regionally, when it comes to mutations, when it comes to genetics. It's not one single population, one single country. It's a very heterogeneous and rich region. And then the other aspect, is really establishing these platforms or networks or connectivity with the rest of the world, because as we said, many rare disease patients just go through similar experiences regardless of where their geography is. So awareness for me is really key, and this is why, in fact, we undertook recently a project in collaboration with the Rare Revolution magazine team, and we've just recently published the Spotlight edition on the Middle East, really covering the whole landscape, from regulators to payers to patient groups to physicians to centers of excellence. We've really tried to done a comprehensive coverage of the region, simply because we really want to shed the light on the landscape and raise awareness across the globe that there is a community here that is willing to contribute, to participate, and that needs help as well.
Maybe I'll go next. I think things like this are crucial, and these forums to bring people together from all different parts of the world. And they say that the main effect of COVID has been to kind of accelerate things that were already happening anyway when it comes to connectivity. So I completely agree with that point that Karim was making. I've been in a number of forums that used to be live forums but are now virtual forums, where individuals in one country have a particular experience of how to raise awareness of a particular disease or of a study, or a campaign in their country, and they did something in a new and innovative way. And now it's much easier for them to have, not just say, here is what I did, but to have these dialogues to discuss how you might tweak things to work in different places in the world, and how you might further bring together minds that in the past might have exchanged emails maybe, but now have the opportunity to interface with each other in this way, in this collaborative way, in a virtual environment. So I think we're going to be using this more and more. I feel like I talk to my international colleagues way more than I did before, when I used to go to the office every day. And I can see that continuing, because there's so many experiences out there that we can leverage if you just have the opportunity to easily share and have a dialogue about them.
I'll finish just with a comment that, one of the reasons the stakeholder community of the rare disease is going to be so critical is that, so much of the opportunity landscape lays in large-scale genomics and diagnostics. But at the same time, this is a field that's becoming increasingly competitive, in a field that is increasingly monetized. Even at the national level, meaning that national entities are beginning to see data as an economically owned space that's national. But the rare diseases are not national, they're global. And so one of the risks and one of the opportunities that I would strongly encourage is to pay attention to that context and to advocate on behalf of connectivity of data that is global, because there will be motivations and instincts by national entities to think of data as a resource that's national. And that would actually harm the rare disease context if we didn't maintain thoroughfares for connectivity.
I am muted. That's a benefit of having tech support right next to you. They catch you with you're muted before you can even get there to the button. Thank you so much, each of you, for joining us and really sharing the insights that you provided this afternoon, because as you said, Leslie, this is where it happens. This is kind of the genesis of where it's going to be starting. And I have no doubt I will be bothering each of you in the future to pick your brains some more. But thank you so much for sharing your experience and kind of where you see the path forward. It gives me as a parent and a patient a great deal of hope to know people like you are on top of things. So thank you for your contributions. Thank you for spending time with us. Kareem, I hope you get some sleep now.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for the
It's a
opportunity.
pleasure. Thank you so much, Leslie. Adam, thank you so much. And we will all be in touch soon. Have a great weekend, guys.
Hey, great
Thanks,
talking to you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Juliet. How are you?